Wave 4 of the DLC for Xenoblade 3 is becoming one of the most anticipated releases in the latter half of this year, and one of the major reasons for that is the return of Alvis, who is ready to proclaim the end. Even so, it's been 3 years now since we last saw our boy on the big screen, and 13 years since his initial debut, so let's quickly recap who Alvis is and what he did within the story of Xenoblade 1, along with a few extra cool details that you might not be aware of. Before we jump into all of that though, if you enjoy this type of content and want to see more of it on the channel, then let me know by smashing that like and subscribe button so that you can stay up to date with all the latest Xenoblade news, theories, and so much more, as well as it simply helping me out a ton. With all that out of the way, let's get right into the video. Alvis is one of the most mysterious characters in the Xenoblade Saga to date. He was the one who taught Shulk how to truly unlock the Monado's power, whilst being both a seer for the High Entia and a member of Zanza's Trinity, feigning ignorance of his illusory superiority. He possesses a very calm and well-mannered demeanour, acting as an aid to those he is currently accompanying, which for the majority of the game happens to be the party. Our first encounter with Alvis occurs sooner than you might expect, specifically during our first visit to Tephra Cave, where he briefly speaks to Shulk within a dream. Shortly afterwards, he makes an appearance once again by supporting the party in battle against Metalface with the assistance of a Telethia, but remains hidden to the group throughout, only finally introducing himself once we enter Mactha Forest, teaching Shulk how to use the Monado and thus defeat the Telethia, before mysteriously disappearing once more. His next appearance follows soon after within Alchemoth, where we learn of Alvis' status within the capital and proceed to save Melia from the Bionite Order. From here onwards, Alvis accompanies the party throughout their adventure until they reach Sword Valley, temporarily leaving the group to help organize the allied force of Bionis, and not returning until the advance upon the Mechonis has begun, after receiving a vision about the events within the Mechonis core, arriving at the last moment to catch them on the junks. For the remainder of the game, Alvis chaperones the party via both speaking to Shulk within his memory space and aiding the party in the physical world, up until the moment he betrays the group. The final time we then see Alvis is during the end sequence of the game, this time appearing as a green star, dethroning Zanza and acting upon Shulk's wish for a world with no need for gods, bringing his story and this recap to an end. But now that we're aware of Alvis' actions throughout the story of Xenoblade 1, it's time to take a look at some of the inspirations that led to the creation of his character. For instance, Alvis is based off of a number of characters from the previous Xeno games, so spoilers for both Saga and Gears. When it comes to Xenogears, from a narrative perspective, Alvis is the equivalent character to Abel. Abel was the first being to touch the Zohar, becoming a contact for the Wave existence and granting him the ability to reincarnate over history, eventually becoming Fae. Likewise, Alvis possesses a strong connection to the Conduit, with him functioning similarly as a gate, allowing ether to pass through his self and enter the world of Bionis and Mechonis. The two thus represent beings that are connected to a higher domain and breathe life into the world below. In terms of Xenosaga, there are 3 examples that we can draw from: Wilhelm, Chaos, and Udo. Thematically, Alvis is the same character as Wilhelm, both being omniscient figures who never age with the same mannerisms. However, Wilhelm is the main antagonist of the series, whereas Alvis is not. On the other hand, Chaos is comparable through their designs and personalities, but there's actually an even better example. Turns out that this particular cutscene in Xenoblade 1 is ripped straight out of Xenosaga, with Alvis replacing Chaos, so I think that's all the evidence you'll need. Lastly, we have Udo, who is more of an interesting case. You see, way back when in the early 2000s, Xenosaga Episode 2 got leaked, containing a description of Udo that resembles Alvis, primarily him being an AI life form. Ultimately, thanks to Namco fucking everything up, This didn't actually end up happening, but it's still plausible that Alvis was inspired based on these original versions of voodoo, which I find very interesting. Finally, as I've mentioned a number of times on the channel now, Alvis is virtually a carbon copy of the Christ from Valentinian Gnosticism in Xenoblade form. The entire events of Xenoblade 1 in fact depict parts of Gnosticism, with Alvis filling in the role as the Christ. To summarize, Alvis remains as an ambiguous individual, aiding those who have the potential to create a brighter future than what is presently predetermined. He acts as a guiding force, teaching the people of this fragmented world how to forge a future for themselves, in the hopes to prevent their inevitable destruction. Whilst he may act calm and collected at all times, Alvis is truly a person who seeks the good within people, who can help create a world in which all life walks towards the future, hand in hand. That pretty much sums up who Alvis is. But when it comes to what Alvis is, well, that's a whole nother ballpark. I'll start by getting the obvious out of the way. Whilst it isn't confirmed just yet, it is widely agreed upon that Alvis is the third core from the Trinity processor, also known as Ontos. Unlike the other cores that remained in Allrest, Ontos triggered a space-time transition event and ended up in the world of Bionis and Mechonis. Kinda. This was virtually confirmed with the definitive edition of Xenoblade 1 through Alvis's redesign, now featuring a Zohar-shaped core crystal instead of a key on his chest. With this in mind, you might assume that Alvis is simply an Aegis like the other cores from the Trinity processor, but that's not right. Another important distinction is that whilst Alvis himself is Monado, he is different from the power of Monado and the swords themselves. And to explain this briefly, I'm going to have to give you all a quick crash course on the source material of Monados known as Monadology. Within Monadology, there exists a concept known as monads, which is what Monados are based off of. Put simply, everything in the universe possesses a monad in one of three tiers, which is dependent on the complexity of the entity. For instance, an inanimate object like a table would have a basic monad, whereas a living, breathing human person will possess the highest tier of monad. What this means is that absolutely everybody in the Xenoblade universe has their very own unique monado, the shape merely being cosmetic based on the will of the wielder. This is why I stated before in my Wave 3 and 4 analysis video that Alvis shouldn't have Zanza's Monado, as it was unique to him and should no longer exist after his destruction. To awaken one's Monado, however, one must have in some form or another a connection to a higher domain of existence. The only exception comes in the form of replica Monados, as they act as a catalyst to forcefully manifest the power without requiring this influence. However, the abilities the wielder possesses will be reduced in tandem, demonstrated by Shulk losing the ability to perceive visions in future connected. Based on this information, we can identify three different Monados in Xenoblade 1, owned by Zanza, Maineth, and Shulk. These Monados were manifested through the assistance of Alvis, who, in effect, forged the swords for them after they came into contact with the higher domain. This is different from the Aegises, however, who can only forge their own Monados into swords, but are unable to manifest other people's Monados for them. This then leads us on to another concept within Monadology, known as the pre-established harmony, where, in effect, every event ever throughout existence is predetermined to happen. It cannot but happen. Zanza even uses this exact name within Xenoblade 1, so we know for a fact that the series definitely utilizes this concept. Because of this, anything outside of the pre-established harmony, being Alvis, Zanza, Shulk, and Maineth, are automatically empowered, giving them the ability to wield and use Monados. Aegis swords, however, are still Monados, but are awakened and wielded by those inside of the pre-established harmony. The Monados can therefore freely interfere with the world and disturb these predetermined events, as can be seen via Shulk and his visions, whereas the Aegis swords are limited in how much they can change events, and this is the difference between Monados and Aegises. We're still not done, however, as Alvis is still special compared to the other cores due to his connection with the conduit, and more specifically, the wave existence. Bringing this back to Gnosticism, the Christ is a representative of the monad, who is a true godlike being, not to be confused with Monads from Monadology. As Alvis represents the Christ, he is in effect an agent of the wave existent, the equivalent of Monad, gaining his powers from this association. This is why Alvis stated that he was Monado. He wasn't referring to the Monado swords and the power itself, but the entity or existence known as Monado, who we presume to be the wave existent. This then ties back into a whole lot of lore from both Xenoblade Saga and Xenogears, most of which is still relevant due to a number of crossovers that Monolith Soft has made clear, maintaining the validity of the information I have shared thus far throughout this video as being factually accurate. Speaking of things being factually accurate, my statement about Alvis kinda arriving in the world of Bionis and Mechonis technically isn't. As was confirmed with Xenoblade 3, the world was split into multiple identical different worlds, venturing onwards towards their respective futures. However, this wasn't actually the world of the Bionis and Mechonis. Recalling back to the prologue of Xenoblade 1, you may remember this classic line.
Long ago, the world was nothing more than an endless sea, cloaked in a boundless sky, reaching as far as could possibly be imagined.
If both worlds are in fact identical, then the original Allrest should also be an endless ocean, but we know for a fact, thanks to Xenoblade 2, that it isn't. The answer to this conundrum then lies with Alvis and the reality that everything that occurred within Xenoblade 1 actually happened within his memory space. This is a concept that I've brought up a few times in my videos, and the best way to describe it is like a digital pocket dimension that each of the Trinity processor cores have access to. That said, each of the cores have differing levels of this power, with Alvis being able to create extra dimensions within his dimension, whereas Pyra, Mithra and Malos merely use it to recreate Elysium. It also appears that each of their individual memory spaces are linked to one another, based on the fact that both Pyra and Malos can be present in the same place at the same time within it, although we assume that Alvis's may be disconnected due to him being in a completely different world. What this means is that Alvis encompassed Zanza and Meyneth within his memory space, creating an artificial world in which they both incorrectly believe they were gods, mirroring the ideology of Yaldabaoth and the Seven Archons from the Gnostic Apocryphon of John. Anyways, after Zanza's destruction and the world began to stagnate, Alvis moved the remains of the Bionis and Mechonis into the real, physical world, which is then what can be seen in the epilogue of Xenoblade 1. With that out of the way, I'd like to quickly clear up a misconception that I've seen floating around my comments for a while now. Many of you appear to be under the impression that Alvis at heart is simply a machine, and that everything he did in Xenoblade 1 was in relation to this characteristic. Whilst I appreciate that this was a valid theory 10 plus years ago, since the release of Xenoblade 2 and our knowledge of the Trinity cores has expanded, this viewpoint has become rather outdated. Alvis isn't just a computer, following through on the orders he was given, whether that be protecting Zanza's new vessel until it matures, or maintaining a world with no need for gods. He has his own will and can make his own choices, and it's based on this detail that led me to conclude Alvis's intentions in Xenoblade 3. To prove my point, allow me to draw your attention to this scene within Machna Forest. This is a great example of how Alvis influences the story through his own independent actions, as he teaches Shulk a Monado art that is not in Zanza's possession, and what's more, he demonstrates Monado Purge on a Telethia, which need I remind you are Zanza's cells. In fact, Purge is an art entirely based on defeating Telethia, so the sentiment that Alvis was simply guarding Shulk for Zanza becomes irrelevant. To further support this point, Ontos's name derives from the philosophy of ontology, which is based around the idea that the future is decided by those with the will to change it. In effect, the whole narrative theme of all the Xenoblade games. Alvis is thus his own person, who strives forward with this very goal in mind, rather than being a simple machine that merely follows through on the orders programmed into him. And to finish off this video, I'd like to answer one final important question. Is Alvis gay? The answer is yes, specifically for Shulk. I mean, why else would he treat him so well compared to everyone else in Xenoblade 1? He is obviously in love with him. This also leads into the Wave 4 teaser trailer where Alvis isn't evil, but simply jealous. I mean, wouldn't you be angry if your boy toy was stolen away by a Chadosaurus Rex? Sure, destroying the world may be a slight overreaction, but you can see where he's coming from, especially after Shulk placed his hand on his chest. But at least now you understand Alvis's motive for the DLC story of Xenoblade 3. And with that, Alvis has been explained, and I hope you all have a better understanding of exactly who Alvis is and what his character stands for. Let me know in the comments your opinions on Alvis, and if you learned something new from this video. That said, if you've enjoyed, I'd appreciate it if you'd click that subscribe button and notification bell to once more stay up to date with all the latest Xenoblade content I upload on the channel. I thank you all for watching this far into the video though, and hope to catch you in the next one. This is JB, signing off.